everything's going crazy. Welcome to The Crisis That Continues. I'm Will Schick, Director of Product Development. I am joined by the one and only, the fabulous Will Pagani, our Senior Lead Developer, and my cohort in crime for the last few years. It's been so long now when it comes to making Crisis Protocol. So, what are we going to talk about today? We want to cover a whole breadth of topics. We want to talk a little bit about our evolving philosophy and where we've gone with the design of Crisis Protocol, where we think it's kind of going in the future, our hopes and dreams for our sweet little baby, as well as kind of talking about how we dive into the design of the characters and all of that good stuff. So, effectively, where do we start? Let's just start overall what the design goals and philosophy are for Marvel Crisis Protocol since its inception and what has kind of guided us moving forward. And I'm going to let Pagani talk all about that.
Oh, well, the initial goals for Crisis Protocol were always to create like a really fast experience that people could just jump into and enjoy. And I think we've done a phenomenal job of that, if I may say so myself. Community, you can judge for yourself. I will speak for no one. But that was always the hope with Crisis Protocol, is that we can create a very narrative experience where players can play through their own Marvel stories on the tabletop. And it really guided all of everything that we did, right? From the rosters, you get to build your own super team. From Crisis, getting you different little tidbits from the different storylines throughout the Marvel Universe, to characters themselves, obviously, are a big part of the Marvel Universe. And then, of course, the tactic cards, those big wow moments, right? Like, everything that's in the game is built around you telling a story on the tabletop in the Marvel Universe. So that we've been very focused on that, and that's not going to change. We definitely want to do that going forward, and we keep doing that. But we want to explore new ways to do that, and some of the new ways that we've explored to do that are things like Ultimate Encounters, organized play kits like Vibranium Heist, Infinity War. And I believe you even mentioned separation anxiety on another stream.
I did. I think I showed off a little bit of the box,
Yeah.
which I'm super excited about.
Yeah, that one is one of my favorites because it gives like a whole new way to play the game, and that's a big thing that we like to do, is give you as a community and as a player new ways to experience the characters and the storylines and the game itself. That's a huge thing for Crisis Protocol. That being said, I'm not really sure we're ready to announce anything in that way, so maybe this was
super great.
a weird topic to go down.
But we have so much, right? It certainly was the philosophy when we started. You know, one of the things that I set forth in the design doc when you and I began on the project was I wanted to make sure that we were building in a system and mechanics and an ideology that said we have a base game, and from that base game we are going to be able to explore a lot of different variants, a lot of different game modes, different formats and all that. And we did release last year, over December, we released kind of a brief explanation article about that ideology. You know, that you have the base game and then you have game modes, and game modes fundamentally change game rules. So it's not the same game, you know. Ultimate Encounters allow you to play 2v1. One person plays a super powered like boss. The activation system changes. You did a great job like figuring out how all that worked when we started diving into Ultimate Encounters and stuff. You know, we have Separation Anxiety, which is a new game mode that I'm really excited about. That brings up multiplayer free-for-all formats where four players are going to fight each other at the same time. How does priority work in that system? I think we really innovated a really cool idea on how that system works, which we don't have to spoil here, but you look forward to that in the set itself. And then, of course, we made a whole deck of crazy symbiote cards that you can pick up and that affect your characters, and then they fall off of you and they crawl around and try to get on other people. It really comes down to, you know, the ideology of fun, right? How do we inject more fun, more enjoyment, more different experiences in the game so that as many people as possible, like you said before, we want to create a great entry hobby game for people who have never played a miniatures game potentially. That also stands up for people who have been playing miniatures games forever. And part of that is coming up with different ways to play. You know, I've talked with folks who Ultimate Encounters are the way in which they enjoy the game, especially given the current global pandemic and the conditions. And that style of gameplay allows them to enjoy Marvel Crisis Protocol with people who enjoy that style of play. Of course, the base game is always the one that we're looking at the most, and it's the one we expect to be played the most. Formats take the idea of the base game and then they just add an extra strategic layer by changing how your roster construction works. So the game itself plays out identically to the base game, but now you have this extra layer of complexity or challenges or puzzles to solve when it comes to like, okay, I have to draft my characters. I don't get perfect choice, or I can deny my opponent certain characters from their larger list, and now they have to deal with those choices. And I think those are really cool from the more strategic kind of, I want to play the game, but I want to challenge myself tactically and strategically when we get to that table. And so that was all a very big part of it. And of course, it all kind of comes around and it builds on itself to create something where now we're balancing characters and looking at characters in all these different lights and how do they play and function in these different game modes. And that, I think, is probably one of the, as the game continues to grow, we thankfully, I think, have built a foundation that allows us to have a lot of fun and do that. And maintain new and interesting designs that also are within that sandbox. And this is something that you and I have talked about a lot recently, is the idea of, the world and Marvel Crisis Protocol game design development in general, from our ideological standpoint, is it's a sandbox, but it's not a desert. There are edges to where you can play in it.
Yes. Right.
And maybe you can talk a little bit more about what that means in practice when it comes to Marvel Crisis Protocol.
Sure, yeah. So as the game expands and continues to grow, right, we add new rules, we add new things, ultimate encounters, formats, organized play events, all these things, right? But we always want the game to remain accessible. We want the game to remain something that players can handle, right? Because as a game infinitely grows, right, and goes on for years and years and years and years and years, it gets very complicated. There's a lot of stuff going on. So one of the things that we always look at in development for Crisis Protocol, and honestly, whenever I develop anything, is how can we reduce as much of that as possible while keeping things very interesting and unique and fresh? Which is why we have things like the Ultimate Encounter system. We can build all sorts of different encounters based on that one system. We don't have to keep making new systems, right? It's one of the things we also talk about for like team tactic cards. As we have more and more unaffiliated team tactic cards come out, it gets harder for players to choose things. So one of the things that we've kind of done is started looking at unaffiliated team tactic cards really closely and being like, does this need to be unaffiliated, or can we affiliate it with a specific affiliation? I feel like I just said affiliation / affiliated like 30 times.
You nailed it. No, you got it. I think they understand now.
But yeah, so we look at these cards now and we say, hey, does this really need to be, like, could it be unaffiliated? Yeah, sure, it could, right? But like, does it need to be unaffiliated? And if it doesn't need to be, it's not going to be anymore, is really kind of the way going forward. So that's a way for us to sort of curtail that complication of the game continuing as just a specific example, right? Because from the beginning, we always said we want you to be able to play all characters together, and we're not going to change that. That is still absolutely the goal of Crisis Protocol. We don't really want to ever tell you who you can and can't play with who, because the team-ups in Marvel are infinite. So where that is a complication point that will expand forever, where we can take other complication points out or reduce them, that's really sort of the goal going forward with the edges on the sandbox, as you said it, right? Is how can we play inside of that sandbox and continue to develop interesting, cool, unique things without really contributing to bloat or overcomplication simply for the fact of adding new stuff, right? So yeah, that's really something that I'm not really sure that I thought about at the very beginning of Crisis Protocol. That has really changed over the first year and almost a half. Time really is an illusion.
It is.
Yeah, but over the first year-ish and a half-ish of Crisis Protocol, we've learned so much about the game and how to develop it going forward and the types of strategies that are powerful and that kind of thing. So it's been a great experience.
Well, I think one of the things that we established very early on, which I know was a bit of a conversation, which we've talked about a little bit, and certain players will know, there's always a push-pull tension when you talk about complexity points when it comes to the idea of standardized rules. You have game systems that use universal rules. So a good example of a universal rule in this instance is like flight or wall crawler. It's just a keyword that means the same thing all the time, and you just simply apply it to a character. In Crisis Protocol, because the abilities and the naming conventions of the characters are so unique and part of how we get that flavor through, it was really important to me up front, and eventually we kind of came to an agreement in terms of how to implement it, that we would have standardized rules text. We would have abilities that kind of all do the same thing. A great example is like Spider Sense versus an ability that also allows you to do rerolls as well that isn't Spider Sense, like the rules on Daredevil. Or Daredevil had at one point, I think, that rule. If he doesn't now, time is very much an illusion.
I think he counts blanks now, but yeah, it used to be.
It used to be exactly Spider Sense, his echolocation ability. But by doing that, what it allows us to do is we can standardize effects and rules. We can change certain numbers within that, but we also don't sacrifice our ability to make the characters feel unique by doing different combinations. And I, again, like to go back to the cooking analogy where we kind of set our ingredients lists and then we simply make new recipes based on like what we throw into the bowl and how we cook them up. And that has proven to be, I think, really useful, and we've been able to squeeze out an incredible amount of diversity and interest in the characters and how they function, while still maintaining a rule set that I think, as you talked about, the characters will infinitely grow, but our sandbox will not. And that, to me, is a really important part of making the game accessible and making it interesting.
And I think it's also important to mention here, right? This doesn't mean that we won't create new rules, right? Because we will. But when we create new characters, it's really important to us that when you read a rule, it's not confused with another rule. Mm-hmm. So if that makes sense. So like, and to give an example, right? We have Iron Man. Gosh, it's so long ago now, and the name changed so many times back then. But his invulnerability rule, the rule that reduces
the invincible Iron Man.
The invincible Iron Man. There you go. And then Thanos also has a damage reduction rule. And this is kind of where we broke that, right? Where every other damage reduction rule in the game has to a minimum of 1, but Thanos does not, because we're like, well, he's stronger, he's that kind of thing. But we only want to use that where we take a rule that everyone's familiar with and then change it a little bit, very sparingly. So when you see rules, they're going to be like, if you have a throw, it's going to be the same, right? The numbers might change, but it's always going to work the same. When you see like bodyguard is in a couple places now as well. And sometimes the name changes, but it's always bodyguard, right? Mm-hmm. So like we always try and standardize that way, but we can change the names of things to give them thematic and flavorful meaning to characters. Mm-hmm. And I think that's sort of one of our insider tricks. Shh, don't tell. To those things where we have the same rules with different names, so we don't necessarily add to our complexity budget, but we can still get the flavor and the uniqueness out of each thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so let's dive a little further and talk about the overall character process, and then let's see. We have some spicy reveals in terms of how
I would call it spicy.
How they go into play. I think many people will be very interested to see what we have to offer in this day 3 stream. But the general process is we have kind of a concept stage, primarily. What happens is either as a group or in smaller subsets, or sometimes just myself, through conversations with both our amazing partners at Marvel and then just internally and looking at the game and where we want to go next, we will choose a cast of characters from the Marvel Universe that we feel are the next best expansion material going forward. And this list goes very, very far in the future, because if you've ever heard us talk on stream, it is at least a year, and that's kind of like rushing it to get a character done for a miniatures game, both in game rules and sculpt. And we really like 18 to 24 months. So I think Marco and Dallas mentioned this in the last stream, but we are so far ahead from where the community releases actually are that sometimes it's hard to remember where in space and time you are, and this also leads to time being an illusion. Once we've chosen those characters and everyone is signed off on them as being great additions to the roster of amazing characters that we already have, we go through a character design period. Most of the time I will take care of the character designs myself, although other people, including Josh and Pagani and many others on the team, have had their hands in certain characters that they super love. I always defer to you, Pagani, whenever we're dealing with a character that is going to be a super boss. You took over Thanos, you did Magneto. I also believe you did Sin, just as a random. You were like, I want to do Sin. I have crazy ideas for her. And I was like, all right, go for it. And we talked about that one as well. But a design
brief was very exciting.
Yeah, a design brief gets written up, And basically what that is it is all of the character rules, but in non-rules language. Sometimes we steal from existing rules. So like you mentioned, a throw is always the same thing. So we'll just grab the throw rules that we want. Maybe we'll change a number. If something brand new is coming up, which has happened, and one of the characters we're going to talk about does have 2 very new rules. That
It's 2?
had yeah, just 2. I mean, 2 that I would consider very, very new. And are ones that I'm excited to talk about because I remember the face you made when I presented them in the plain like language text. And I was like, I know we can do this.
Mm-hmm.
And you were like, yeah. And I was like, I know we can do this. And that's where we move on. We do have an internal review where we simply go through and a bunch of us get together and we say, does this feel like the character? Are we missing elements? Are we capturing that identity in the specific period of time that we're talking about for the character? At that point, we move on to development, which is where you and Sarah really come in. Now that Sarah has joined the team, and you take all of that plain rules language that just tells you what to do, and you turn it into actual rules language so that it actually functions within the game mechanics and all of that process.
That's always the fun part, right? Because it's like, where does this comma go? Does the rule change if we miss a comma?
It's amazing how an improperly placed article can completely change the intent of a rule itself.
Yeah.
We go through a couple of revision steps. We do a lot of back and forth, you and I, to make sure that your language is coming out in the way that I wanted the rule to be. Again, making sure the commas and all of that stuff are in place. Is it supposed to be another character? Is it any allied character? All of these things are very important to the intent of the rule. Once we've signed off on that, we do a lot of internal alpha play testing, and then we throw it into the world of testing in general, which I know you have a very strong hand in. So tell us how you toss your baby into the cold, harsh reality of real life.
Well, we just send out PDFs to the playtesters, and then we all sit there and go, did it work? Right? No, not really. So we have, gosh, I don't even know at this point, 14, I think, playtest groups, a bunch of playtest groups that are made up of multiple people. And they get these characters, and usually we start off with like a review round. What do you guys think? Are these cool? Are these not cool? Are these overpowered? Are these not overpowered? Because a lot of the stuff in the alpha testing that we do internally, it's balance focused, but it's not always like laser focused on what's happening in terms of balance, right? It's really like, is the field correct? Do the rules function? That kind of thing. And then for, gosh, I don't know, to several months, we then push it out to the external testers, and the external testers will go through it. They'll give us their feedback. They'll talk to us about things. They'll develop strategies around the characters and the cards and all that kind of stuff, and then they'll test them as testers do. And there's a really big back and forth between us and the play testers and stuff, and we learn a lot from them, and we can give them insight into what our intention for things were. And yeah, it's a very collaborative process with them, and we really couldn't do it without them.
Yeah, and of course we iterate. Eventually we lock the rules. They go onto a card. We get a cool sculpt to go along with it. We get awesome painted miniatures, and then we finally have characters into the wild, and we get to watch all of the amazing hot takes from the community as we post up surprise spoilers and teasers and all of that good stuff. So it's
the hot takes phase might be my favorite.
It is pretty amazing. It's always, and it's a process that happens multiple times. Speaking of that, let's go ahead and let's talk a little bit about how this process can help craft some pretty incredible characters. The first one being this fella right here, Mysterio. So Mysterio was a really kind of unique character in general because he was designed with the initial core set characters way back when we were first starting work on the game. He was in like batch 2, I think, along with several others, including Green Goblin, who we talked about in a previous panel. So his fundamental design was really it's in its infancy when we finally came back. He got put on a shelf for a while because of the way the schedule changed and stuff. The fundamental design goals, though, remained very consistent. The goal was to capture the idea of a character that he uses a lot of tricks, right? He's very difficult to get to, but once you do, he's kind of just a regular dude. And if you can get through all of like the nonsense that he throws your way, punching him in the face is fairly simple. However, there's a lot of effort that's exposed, and I felt that really looking at all the Spider-Man stories and the comics that I had read over time, like that was the Quentin Beck we wanted, and we
Sure.
iterated and messed with it, and I think there were a lot of different changes that occurred. And I don't know if you have a favorite story of kind of how he evolved over time, but we can maybe take a look at the card, or at least the healthy side of the card, and talk
Yeah,
a little bit
let's take a look.
specifically about that. Let's put it up. Let's put it up for everyone.
Yeah, so Mysterio here, well, the first things first before chat totally loses their mind. He has one physical and one energy defense, and that's gonna be a topic of this stream is dealing with characters that have one defense and a couple stats that we're gonna come back to a little bit later for another character here. But before you freak out too much, make sure to look at the Smoke and Mirrors special rule down there, which will let him use his Mystic defense instead of the physical or energy defense, unless your opponent pays 2 power, which is very similar to Enchantress.
And it's a
He
great.
was kind of the progenitor of that rule a million years ago.
I'm gonna say it's a great way on how design can be iterative and how you can learn things. We came up with this rule through the Enchantress process, like you mentioned, and when we came back to Mysterio, we replaced the original Smoke and Mirrors rule, which was very different, with this rule. And in doing so, we created a really interesting, like super robust 3-threat character that is also, again, if you're willing to put in the resources, not that robust once you see through all the trickery. I know one of the ones that was probably the most unique in terms of its playtest and iteration and getting the balance right was Tricks and Traps. Tricks and Traps, I think, went through about 5 or 6 different versions, where it was either too powerful, it was too weak, until it started to feel just right, and it became a very big piece of Mysterio's kit and the puzzle to unlocking the best of what he has.
Yeah, so I think it's important that we talk about the goal of this character, right? And the goal of this character is very similar to that of the goal of Loki. And as we've talked about Loki several times on these streams in the past, and Loki is a very difficult character to make, and Mysterio is a very difficult character to make, right? Because the character is entirely based around frustrating people. Like that is what Mysterio does. That is what Loki does. It's the same goal, right? And that's very difficult to make in a game because you don't want to frustrate people while they're playing a game for fun.
Unless it's a fun frustration. It's about unlocking the puzzle, right? And that's the trick.
So much of this character and so much of Loki's character is how can we create rules that allow sort of one player to annoy the other player without going too far, basically, to where it like becomes an issue in the game. So it's a very fine line to walk. And Mysterio, I think, is phenomenal at that. So Tricks and Traps, when you end a movement, which could be advance, climb, place, push, throw, is that all of them? So anything under the movement section of the rulebook. So any type of movement, he can use the superpower, and it costs 3 power, which is quite a bit. And you'll also notice that he's not particularly good at making power. He has a strength 4 attack that gains power equal to damage dealt. So 3 is a pretty significant investment for him. But then he gets to roll some dice, and if it deals damage, he can advance short. And this is a very powerful rule, right? Because what it does is it says basically if you're range 2 with all of your attacks, and there are a few characters like this, if Mysterio damages you with Tricks and Traps, you can't attack him. So like he walks up to you, he rolls his dice. If he damages you, he walks away. You can't attack him. But he's given up his crisis point, right? His objective point. So it's sort of that like give and take. As he illusions and walks away, you're getting the objective for now, until he comes back with Hypnosis Gas, which can then move you. So now you walk up to him, he walks away, he Hypnosis Gases you, you walk away, because that's what he does, and now he can go back and get the point, right? So it's this very like illusory kind of like push and pull. You don't really quite understand what's happening going on between these two rules. And there are also some very interesting interactions with Hypnosis Gas, right? Because one of the big things for Mysterio is that he kind of tricks you into doing what he wants, right? So Hypnosis Gas can move characters. Well, Tricks and Traps triggers off of moving characters. So he can even hypnosis gas you up to himself, then use tricks and traps on you to do you some more damage and move again, right? So like you get these really fluid, constantly shifting board states out of Mysterio, where you never quite know where he's going to be or how he's going to end up, or even where your characters are going to end up or what your characters are going to do. So I really love how tricks and traps, hypnosis gas, and curtain call to a lesser extent really all combine together to create this very mobile, very weird character interaction, right?
Well, and there's one last piece to that puzzle too, which you haven't mentioned, which I'm a little surprised, is stealth. Sure. Because stealth, you know, yes, Loki is able to move away, but in order to avoid, say, a ranged attack like a repulsor blast, even though the game doesn't have ranged attacks, but something that has a range greater than 2,
sure.
He has to either get out of line of sight or get out of range. As long as Loki can get further than range 3 of the character that's trying to attack, he now has stealth protection and you can't attack him anymore. So it just throws in more to that whole fluid, like, is he there? Is he not there? What's happening? Like, what do I do? And he can be a very interesting puzzle to try to solve. And of course, he brings a lot to the Spider Foes affiliation, and he also works very well with the Criminal Syndicate affiliation, due to kind of like the way in which he's able to manipulate the board state. All right, moving.
I don't have the card in front of me, but I believe he is included in both of those. Do you?
I know he's included in Spider Foes. I'm like 90% sure he's in Criminal Syndicate as well. But we'll save that confirmation for another day. So moving on, because we have a lot to cover and we got a little bit more to go. Carnage. So Carnage comes with Mysterio, and it's funny that this worked out this way. It wasn't initially intended, but Carnage also shares something in common with Mr. Mysterio in that he also has one energy defense and 1 mystic defense with 5 physical defense.
Yeah, so he's our highest physical defense character, just right out the gate.
And
non-ultimate counter.
And another interesting thing about Carnage is that he also represents somebody who was made in the initial batch of characters. However, unlike Mysterio, who changed a lot, Carnage actually really didn't change much. The wording of his abilities and kind of how they functioned as we learned more and more about the game actually, certainly affected things, but the idea that he was a super big physical defense guy with really low energy and mystic defense because he's crazy, and we wanted to represent the symbiote's severe aversion to fire from the Maximum Carnage run, all led to this character who's super robust. He has a lot of stamina. He's very good against physical attacks. He can make a ton of attacks. He deals a ton of damage. And then he also has this ability to heal himself completely when he dazes or KOs somebody. So he kind of plays like this yo-yo game where, he gets right on the edge of being dazed or KO'd, and then he pulls off, paint the town red, and all of a sudden he's like right back to normal.
Yeah, I think the only real major changes that happened to this guy during development were with Maximum Carnage, which went through a couple. I mean, it was pretty crazy at the start.
It started crazy. It got really toned down. Then it went back to being absolutely crazy. Like there was a time where he could daisy chain nonstop.
Infinite attacks, yeah.
And I believe that his maximum quote unquote kill count was six characters in a single activation.
He did daze or KO an entire team in one go, and we were like, okay, maybe this is a bit much.
maybe we need to dial back. One of the things that I was really a fan of with Carnage is that we were able to bring back the Arch Nemesis rule, which to me is one of those rules that really encapsulates the goal of Marvel Crisis Protocol, which is to bring these characters to life in fun and interesting ways. Arch Nemesis with Eddie Brock makes perfect sense from the character's standpoint in the comics, and everything we've seen about them. And of course, it's a fun puzzle to play around that has both benefits and negatives depending on how you utilize it in your board state and stuff.
Yeah, I love this character, right? Like he moves around the table. He does incredible amounts of damage, right? If you use sadistically with Maximum Carnage, you get a 9 dice area attack. And then to talk about the Rampage trigger on Maximum Carnage, right? So that one's a little tricky, and this is one of those complexity things that we talked about earlier where we add in something like this, and I'm always a little wary of adding things specifically like this to characters because it's not like super obvious how this works. So let's talk through it for a moment. An area attack will generate multiple attacks, right? And in each of those attack rolls, if you roll a hit and a wild, you get to rampage. So after that individual attack from the area attack, it'll do 1 damage to everyone around it. So what does that do? That says that if there's a huge clump of people, Carnage might just daze or KO all of them, right? Because each one of those attacks could do 1 damage to everyone else around, right? So that to me really embodies, and we've seen this in a couple of artworks for Carnage already, right? That he just jumps in to the fray, just absolutely craziness, right? And he gets in there and he wants to fight as many people at the same time as he can. And then through Paint the Town Red, like, he can get pretty durable. I mean, he's got 7 stamina. He's got 5 physical defense. My gosh, watch out, physical attackers. But then you have this like really powerful counterplay, and this was something that we did with Venom as well, right? He has 2 energy defense, of 1 energy defense and 1 mystic defense. So he's this really like unpredictable sort of Gambit character. I realized I just said Gambit character.
You did.
I did, but Gambit as in like I'm taking a bet, not as in somebody who throws cards at people. But that would be an interesting crossover. Anyways, so he's this Gambit character where he can jump in and like do all of this damage, and then if they don't kill him, he can just fully heal.
Do it again. He can do it all over again.
Personally, I like to save him towards the end of my round for activations, so I know that he can't really get teamed up on. Throw him in there, hit a maximum carnage, do some symbiote tendrils, do all that kind of stuff, right? And then their first couple activations next turn, if they don't deal with him or they only do him half damage or something, maybe I can then activate and finish off a character, Paint the Town Red, and fully heal and sort of deal with the damage they dealt with him. Sort of like Venom does, but in a completely different way. So I really like how we were able to get the theme of the 2 symbiotes together, but execute it in a very different way.
All right, so we have about 10 minutes left. We have to talk about
10 minutes.
The most exciting to me, the most exciting character, Amazing Spider-Man. So we did a big launch trailer. We've been talking about him over the course of Mini-stravaganza. This is the big moment. We wanted to show off a little bit of what to expect from this brand new version of Peter Parker. Amazing Spider-Man, truly amazing. So the goal behind this character was to really embody Peter Parker at his height. This is the Spider-Man that I think most people think about in terms of the modern day comics. He's in like his mid to late 20s. He has fully mastered his abilities. He's saved the world countless times. He has been an icon to people like Miles Morales, Ghost Spider, Gwen Stacy. You know, he is here. So the first thing I think people will notice is that he is a Threat 5 character. He is a big boy. He also represents, in terms of the Web Warriors affiliation, the big bruiser for this affiliation. Most of the Web Warriors they're about movement, positional, like craziness. They're pulling you off objectives. They don't really have, outside of a Venom, somebody who just wants to get in there and mix it up. And Amazing Spider-Man is your guy. He's going to go in there and he's just going to start whooping some serious tuchus. So the 2 rules that I really wanted to focus on, which are kind of like the crazy brand new rules, as I was designing and concepting this guy in my head, I kept going back to, I wanted somebody who could just beat the tar out of people, but do it in a Spider-Man way, and keep him really mobile and interesting, but tie all of his mobility and his tricks to his attacks, to incentivize and lead players into the idea that this Spider-Man bounces off the walls, but he bounces off the walls by bouncing off your face. And the way we did that was through momentum, which is probably one of my favorite rules, where I puzzled out, like initially in Plains rules language, I was like, I want him to be able to jump, kick a guy in the face, and then kick another guy in the face as he bounces off. And momentum was the result of that idea, where he basically gets to throw himself. He gets to pounce off of his momentum attack, off of his spider strike attack. And then whatever a spider can, I really wanted him to have a throw rule, but I wanted it to be tied to his big attack. And so catch became the new way in which we do this. So he gets to beat you up with whatever a spider can. Then he gets to do a very Peter Parker thing where he grabs a car, spins it around with his web, and throws it into you as you're reeling from all the punches that you've taken, and he gets to yell catch. Of
And that's
course,
going to get into witty banter down below, I think.
and yeah, I was going to leave witty banter a little bit. So, of course, he is a leader for the Web Warriors. He has a brand new leadership. That leadership went through several iterations before we finally wound up with this, which kind of plays into the idea of the Web Warriors' desire to reposition you. It plays with slow tokens, which also goes back into All Webbed Up, the team tactic card that is unique to Web Warriors. So it makes it very efficient there. And I think it brings out a really interesting choice between him or Miles for your team. And one of the things that I think really makes that choice most interesting was something that you pushed for throughout testing. And eventually I came on board that it was a great idea, because it truly was a great idea, which is Mastered Spider Sense. Mastered Spider Sense used to actually allow you to reroll fails, just innately. And one of the great arguments that you brought up and pointed out was, like, if you remove the reroll fails, not only does it bring him back in line with Threat 5, because he was like way overperforming, but it also makes it a really interesting choice. Do you want Miles for his leadership, or do you want Amazing Spider-Man for his leadership? And now there's a reason to have Miles and Amazing Spider-Man when Miles is going to be the leader, as opposed to always just having Amazing Spider-Man be the leader with Miles, or vice versa. And so I think that works out really great, and it makes it a very interesting and fun roster. Those strategic choices, those options that you make. And then, of course, there's Witty Banter, which I'll let you walk people through how we wound up in the end of Witty Banter, because we had some really bad puns at first, and then eventually we came to this, and this is another really useful kit for the Amazing Spider-Man Peter Parker to use.
So I always love it when you can take a character that's really combat focused, like this Peter Parker, and then give them some type of really clever support style ability. And Witty Banter is that, right? And Witty Banter did go through a lot of different versions, and my favorite version, which turned out to just be incredibly way too strong, was, instead of re-rolling when your opponents die in their attack roll, was when someone is targeted, you use Witty Banter, and it gives them the shock special condition. And then, of course, everybody was like, well, I mean, he's not really shooting taser webs at this point. I'm like, no, like, they're literally shocked because he made a joke.
Bad puns for the win.
And then everybody just groaned and was like, it's perfect. But it was way too good. So we didn't go with that one. So we ended up with the, you may reroll one die in the attack roll. And this one power cost, right, it's a sort of a tax on the character, right? Like, it's not substantial in terms of, like, it's one power, right? But, like, how often do you have the option to use this rule? Well, most characters attack in their activations. If Amazing Spider-Man is hanging out in your team, most of your team is within range 3, so basically every attack you could spend one power. Well, you're going to run out of power pretty quick, because where Spider Sense gains power for the damage dealt and is strength 5, and with Web Swing you can go to strength 7, that makes a lot of power, right? But, like, what if you want to whatever a spider can, or what if you want to web swing more later, or that kind of thing. So you just have to be really careful with how often you use Witty Banter. And Witty Banter is, of course, very powerful, right? Rerolling an attack die can get rid of triggers. It can get rid of wild effects. It can get rid of all these things. It can just get rid of a success. So it could be it's one power to 50-50 not take a damage. Like, okay, that's pretty good. But I think it really shines when it's like, oh man, they need this wild effect to move me off this point to score a point or something, and you're like, okay, reroll your wild. And then it becomes a much less of a chance that they actually get that wild, right? That wild result. So, and then of course you couple it with all the spider senses where the spider people are rerolling their defense. So you really just get this, like, multi-layered defensive strategy out of the spider people that is really good and really fun. And I think it really epitomizes, like, how they dodge things instead of, like, necessarily just being like, I am invincible, and then something smashes on them and then they're fine. I think it really plays into that sort of play style into it. Something that I really want to bring up.
About
you go first.
The other thing I really like about the ability is, again, we talk about kind of leading players down what we consider the correct play path. And specifically with Witty Banter, you notice he has to be within range 3 of the attacking enemy character. Most defensive abilities typically trigger off of being close to your allied character, but this really says, like, you put Amazing Spider-Man in the middle of your opponent's army, of their squad, so he's beating the crap out of everybody, and then when they try to attack not him, he just makes a really bad quip or insults them, and then all of a sudden, like, it throws them off their game. So now they kind of have to be forced to deal with him. He acts as this pseudo bodyguard.
Worth noting that it does work on him as well. but
Mm-hmm.
yes. Um, but one of the things that I really love about this Spider-Man character versus and in foil to the core set Spider-Man is this Spider-Man doesn't really have a way to move enemy characters, right? And that's kind of like one of the big things for Spider or not Spider Foes, uh, Web Warriors is that they move around enemy characters, right? So one of the things that we really pushed for with this character is that he, besides his leadership, which we can talk about in a second here if we have time. Do we have time?
Oh, we do
Three
not have
minutes.
time, sir. That will
Okay,
be
well,
saved for
his
the
leadership
next
can do
one.
it, but he doesn't have a way to move enemy characters, so he doesn't play into sort of the normal strategy of Web Warriors. So if you're still making a very objective based Web Warrior team, there's still a reason to take the core set Spider-Man. And when we make second versions of characters, that's always something that I think about, that I try and do is when we make the second version of the character, I don't ever want to step on the toes of the first version of the character because we want those to remain as viable as possible in lists. And I know that core set Spider-Man has found a really good home inside the Web Warriors affiliation.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah,
if,
and I
if
think
you want to play that style, that's still there for you.
that was one of the super fun things in designing and developing this version of Peter Parker. It was, how do we offer something that's very different that completely encapsulates the different eras and style of these two characters who are the same person but at very different stages in their life. And hopefully everyone, once they have the chance to play with these characters, gets to see all of the fun synergies and tactics that you get to use with them. They get to feel that character and recreate all of those great battles from the pages of the comics with them. So that is all the time we have. We could probably spend a whole nother hour on stuff, but I think we're ending at a really good spot. Thank you all for joining us. Be sure to stay tuned. Next up, we have Creative Director Dallas Kemp going through how to paint human flesh tones on your miniatures. It's always an important one. There's a lot of skin tones that have to be covered on every miniature as well. Thank you so much for joining me, Mr. Pagani. It's always a pleasure. I look forward to chatting with you here shortly as we move forward with the rest of Mini-stravaganza Day 3. Until then, everyone, stay safe, be happy. We will see you on the next one.